Ships are, and this may surprise you, very big, and they take a lot of careful and complex mathematics and calculations to design correctly. In the last video in this series, we saw how a simple single error could be carried right through from design to construction and lead to catastrophe. But some errors are larger and broader. Some ships are doomed from the very start, not just because of one mathematical error or a single calculation, but because their very reason for being is built around possible design deficiencies that are actually key to their function in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and today we'll look at 2 more design failures from history. Now this first one is actually very contentious. See, I said before that sometimes a ship's failure in design can come down to just one simple mistake. Last time we looked at how the Hunt-class destroyers were almost an absolute dismal failure because somebody got their math wrong. But long before those destroyer escorts were dreamt up, the Royal Navy was experimenting with a new class of warship that was designed to combine the speed and agility of a cruiser and the armament and power of a battleship. And the combination would result in an interesting new class of warship that met both success and terrible catastrophe, and it would cast doubt over the entire concept that endures to this day. Battleships and cruisers are classes of warship that are very, very different to one another, and the distinction was even more evident in the years before the First World War. See, back then, battleships were these large, fairly slow, heavy hitters like prize fighters of the Navy designed for absolute dominance in a fleet action. In the early 1900s, the navies of the world were experimenting with fitting as many guns as they could to these powerful ships with some pretty mixed results. The Royal Navy changed the game in 1906 with the world-famous HMS Dreadnought, a battleship that was very quick for her day at 21 knots, but more crucially, the ship had a uniform main battery. She was designed so that large turrets could field guns of 12 inches, or 305mm in such a way that powerful broadsides could be brought to bear, or, if the ship was facing stem onto the enemy, that is directly in front or behind, then at least 6 main guns could be put on target. Now this changed the idea of what a battleship was, and soon the world's navies were rushing to build their own dreadnoughts. And in a fierce naval arms race with Germany, Great Britain's Admiralty rushed to rebuild their own navy and replace many of their aging, lumbering, awkward battleships with dreadnought-style warships instead. But meanwhile, there had actually also been a cruiser arms race brewing for years. The cruisers were not like battleships, they were smaller, leaner, and faster, and therefore could mount only smaller caliber guns and torpedoes, but their benefit was obvious: supporting the battleships, outmaneuvering the enemy, and being a thorn in the enemy fleet's side. But against battleships, cruisers could only hope to pepper them with smaller caliber gunfire, maybe even start a fire on deck or land a torpedo hit. Before Dreadnought was constructed, British Admiral John Jackie Fisher had been toying with the idea of taking a cruiser and remedying its perceived inferiority to the battleship, commissioning designs for the most upgunned cruiser possible. And in the end, a design program ensured that 1 new battleship design would be built, HMS Dreadnought, but 3 new heavily armed and armoured cruisers would be built as well. Now these new cruisers were unlike any other that had been seen before. They were immense in size and carried the huge 12-inch guns that Dreadnought had. Their whole reason for being was to take the fight to the enemy, to run down slower, older warships and hit them hard with their powerful battleship caliber guns. But to do it, the designers had to pull off a few engineering miracles. First, the new style of cruiser had to be extremely long. A longer hull form moves easily through the water and is very hydrodynamically efficient. Typically, the longer and leaner a ship is, the faster it will go. In fact, this new style of cruiser was about 40 feet or 12 meters longer than Dreadnought, but it was narrower. It means they could hit 25 knots. Now this was the same as the then world record holding speedy passenger liner RMS Mauretania. It was very impressive. They also mounted 8 of the big 12-inch or 305mm guns that Dreadnought had. It was only 2 less than that battleship. But where they differed from battleships was in their armour layout. Now this new class of cruiser was as big as a Dreadnought, but it lacked the armour protection afforded to the heavier battleships. Now the reasoning was actually to do mainly with cost and doctrine. The new cruisers were really designed for speedy flanking operations to nip at the enemy, chase him into a place he doesn't want to be in, or to destroy weaker ships with their powerful main armament. but they were not designed to duke it out with battleships of the line. That was Dreadnought's job. So the latter was kitted out with up to 11 inches or 28 centimeters of solid steel belt armour, the armour designed to protect the ship's hull and all the critical machinery and powder magazines inside. She also had 3 inches or 7.6 centimeters of deck armour. Now by contrast, the cruisers got less than half that amount of belt armour and only 2.5 inches or 6.4 centimeters of deck armour. Now the deck armour was important too, because at ranges battleships engaged one another, the shells would be falling downwards thanks to gravity and be likely to hit from above. Now less armour meant that the new cruisers were a little bit lighter than the dreadnoughts, but more importantly they were cheaper to produce. They didn't get heavy armour because it was thought in their normal operation that they just wouldn't need it. They were clearly not anything like the last generation of cruisers. This was something entirely different. But at first, their actual function obviously caused a little bit of confusion within the Admiralty. Early on, this style of ship was referred to as a cruiser battleship and then a dreadnought cruiser. But by 1911, the designation had officially settled on battlecruiser, and a new class of warship was born. The first Royal Navy battlecruiser was given the somewhat ominous name HMS Invincible. Now there's a lot of misinformation and mythology around the battlecruiser and its perceived failure as a class of ship. In many ways, it was actually evolutionary. It led to the largely successful fast battleships of the Second World War. But back in the First World War, the navies of Britain and Germany were excited to deploy their new battlecruiser squadrons, because of course, when Britain started making them, Germany did as well. In 1916, both nations finally got their chance at the infamous, sprawling battle known as Jutland. On May 31st, HMS Invincible herself steamed into action against the large German fleet as part of Vice Admiral David Beatty's dedicated battlecruiser squadron. Now, this was actually the first time the battlecruiser would partake in a proper fleet action against combined enemy warships, which included battleships. Before then, HMS Invincible and her type had seen great success in hunting down and destroying smaller and weaker warships like they were originally intended to. But this battle would be different. The battlecruisers were supposed to harass the German line, and at around 6:15 o'clock on the 31st, they engaged the Germans' equivalent battlecruiser force. The results for the British were not good. HMS Invincible was engaged by 2 German warships, and within just a minute and a half had taken 3 salvos of enemy fire, and then it happened. HMS Invincible did not live up to her name, and she detonated in a spectacular explosion that blew the ship clean in half and sent a great gout of smoke and flame high into the sky. All but 6 of her men were killed, but shockingly, this wasn't the first battlecruiser casualty of the day. Just beforehand, at 4 o'clock, 2 other battlecruisers had actually been lost. HMS Indefatigable, a new class of battlecruiser, had taken about 3 shell hits to her rear gun turret and began to sink when more shell hits blew her magazines and the ship went up, blown in half in a ball of flame. And then, at around about 4:30, the battlecruiser Queen Mary took a hit to her forward magazine and she went up as well. It prompted Beatty, the battlecruiser squadron's commander, to mutter those famous words, "There's something wrong with our bloody ships today." Now there's actually a few key takeaways from this. First of all, in the battlecruisers' early careers, it had been shown that they were highly successful in chasing down and destroying smaller, older ships, but they were clearly not without serious flaws. In engaging the German battlecruisers, Invincible and her fleet mates were encountering battleship caliber shells in return, which hit hard and cut through their thin armour like it was paper. One theory goes that the British employed unsafe and lax handling procedures for their powder, which led to the detonations, but the German fleets actually employed similar practices. Interestingly, one German battlecruiser came very near to detonation at Jutland as well. SMS Seydlitz was hit with a 15-inch shell fired from the British HMS Lion, which slammed into her barbette, the massive cylindrical armour below the gun turret which protects the powder inside. Now the shell didn't penetrate, but it shattered the inside of the barbette's armour, and a red-hot shard of metal ignited some of the powder that was there and started a fire, which killed many of the gun's crew. Now, with only seconds before the ship was going to go up, a German crewman heroically flooded the magazine with water and saved the ship from certain destruction. Now, the incident was a close shave for the Germans, but it highlighted one major design discrepancy between Seydlitz and the British battlecruiser's armour. See, Seydlitz had a barbette with 9 inches or 23 centimeters of protection, whereas HMS Invincible had only 7 inches or 17.8 centimeters. A clean hit on the British barbette was likely to penetrate and spark off a fire within the powder magazine, leading to the detonation of the ship. So, was the British battlecruiser a design failure? Well, the class of ship has attracted much criticism, but it has to be pointed out that for their original intended purpose, the warships proved more than adequate and extremely useful. As technology improved and battleships could be made faster, in the end the battlecruiser gave way to the fast battleships in the 1930s. But in World War II, a few still saw combat. HMS Hood famously suffered a similar magazine detonation when she was hit by the German battleship Bismarck, although that shot seems to have been an extremely lucky one that passed below the ship's belt armour under the waterline. We've actually covered this in a video before, and that kind of shot could have killed a more armoured battleship anyway. In the end, the British battlecruisers deserve a spot on the design failure list because when they were expected to support the main battleship fleet in larger fleet actions, they just couldn't hope to stand up to repeated hits from battleship caliber shells. Now this was a failure more in doctrine, where the design just couldn't keep up. They were extremely useful as protection for merchant convoys against raiders, and they could hunt down and destroy older, smaller warships very easily, but when it came to taking on enemies firing anything as large as a 12 or 15-inch gun, they just didn't have the armour to protect their magazines. Now, you wonder if maybe they'd been built with the German style of more heavily protected barbette, Invincible, Indefatigable, and Queen Mary might have survived. Now, this next one was actually suggested by a viewer of the channel named Chris. Ocean liners are designed to get people from point A to point B as quickly as possible over very large distances, and I've often referred to them as big, luxurious ferries. But the humble ferry shouldn't be underestimated in any way, because these ships also battle through some of the harshest seas in the world. But their development and use has not been without serious incidents, and it's all down to one fundamental Achilles heel. Early ferries took people to nearby locations across water and would winch and manhandle critical cargo on board with cranes or booms. But by the 20th century, cars had taken over as the main form of transport for people over distances on land, and ferries had to be updated to keep with the times. Most passengers had their own cars, and so taking hours to winch individual passenger cars on board, one by one, just wouldn't do. A simpler, faster solution would be needed. Now this birthed the so-called roll-on, roll-off ferry, or ro-ro for short, where passengers could just drive right on up and into the ship themselves. Now you're probably familiar with this type of ship because they're very much in use today, but in the 1940s it was a revolutionary new development, and roll-on, roll-off ships were built to operate on short routes across the world. Now the ability for passengers to drive up and straight into the ship required some design quirks, to say the least. In order to actually get passenger cars on board, a fairly sizable hole would be needed for them to drive through. Now, doors had to be fitted to the ferry's loading bay to keep the ocean out and to keep the hull watertight. Early ro-ro ferries featured doors at their stern on the back of the ship, and right off the bat, having a massive hole in your ship's hull that can cause massive and unchecked flooding is an obvious red flag, and the vessel's safety will come down to the integrity and strength of the doors actually fitted to protect the hull. Now, in a normal ship, watertight compartments would be able to be sealed shut and prevent water from flooding through to the rest of the vessel, but early ro-ro ferries also needed to keep their lower decks clear and open so that cars could actually be driven in and parked. They didn't have watertight compartments on the car decks. Now, this is also a massive red flag as far as ship design goes, but so long as those doors held up, then there shouldn't have been an issue. Well, this was all put to the test, a few times actually, but first, in January 1953, when the early ro-ro ferry Princess Victoria was battling her way through a nasty sea between Stranraer in Scotland and Larne in Northern Ireland. With a gale warning in effect, the ferry put to sea with 179 passengers and crew on board, but it was noted soon after that waves and spray were breaking over the ship's stern and hammering in the doors. Now, this should not necessarily have been a problem. The designers had fitted sliding doors as well as an additional protection in the form of a guillotine door, which would actually drop down like the name implies and provide an additional seal against the water. But there were a few issues. In the day-to-day operation of the ferry, it was found that actually using the guillotine door was impractical and slowed down the whole operation, so it was rarely, if ever, used. But more critically, if the door was damaged at all, it couldn't drop down. And it just so happened that on that January day, the guillotine door was damaged and unable to be lowered. Then massive waves began to burst through the stern doors, and the crew couldn't shut them. With water pouring in and unable to drain, and with no watertight compartments to stop it, the ship began to take on a list to her side, but her captain did his best to change course and keep the stern out of the worst of the waves. With the list worsening and a rescue mission actually struggling to find the ship, it became clear that Princess Victoria did not have long to live. The lifeboat, Sir Samuel Kelly, bravely battled its way through the heaving seas and actually managed to carefully rescue as many as it could before the ferry completely sank and took 153 passengers and crew with her, leaving only 44 survivors. Now, a subsequent inquiry found that the doors had not been designed with enough strength, and they couldn't hope to stand up to the kind of heavy sea one might expect to encounter between Stranraer and Larne. To add insult to injury, though, the scuppers, which were essentially drains intended to carry out any accumulated water in the car decks and dump it over the side, were found to be totally ineffective. So obviously, Princess Victoria was a ship with a few design faults, but surely fitting a heavier duty set of doors would remedy the issue. Well, years later, in 1994, another Ro-Ro ferry very famously met disaster, all thanks to the design of its doors. The Swedish-Estonian ferry Estonia was a decently sized thing, about 15,600 gross tons, and around 515 or 157 metres long. She could carry 2,000 passengers and no fewer than 460 cars between Tallinn in Estonia and Stockholm, Sweden. Now, on September 27, 1994, the ferry set off for Sweden, but encountered heavy seas, up to 20 feet or 6 metres tall, and a wind speed equivalent to a force 10. She battled her way forward for hours, pitching and rolling in the massive waves, when at around 1 a.m. there was a loud bang that reverberated through the ship. A quick inspection from the crew showed no issues. Warning lamps did not sound, and all seemed well. Except the banging sounds continued, and then, just 15 minutes later, Estonia began to roll onto her starboard side. Now clearly something was terribly wrong, and the general emergency alarm was sounded, but things happened too quickly for the ferry and her passengers and crew. Just 50 minutes after the first sign of trouble, Estonia was gone, and she had taken around 850 of her human complement with her. Now, this is actually ranked as one of the worst peacetime shipping disasters in modern history, and immediately the cargo doors were an obvious suspect. Unlike the Princess Victoria, by this point, Ro-Ro ferries were being built with bow loading doors where the ship's forward end would essentially open up like a giant mouth and passengers could drive right in. It made loading and unloading even faster, but obviously those doors had to be able to withstand a huge amount of force, because at the bow of the ship, they would need to bear the brunt of all the ocean's might. It's not an engineering impossibility, but it's difficult to pull off with certainty, and it just so happens that Estonia's doors featured a design fault. The bolts which actually secured the doors to the hull had failed under the strain, and then the complex ramp structure behind it was dislodged in such a way that the alarms weren't rung, and the bridge had no idea that the door was now technically open. Forging ahead, more and more seawater was forced into the hole, and then the vehicle deck. Being the middle of the night, the deck was uninhabited at the time, no warning was sounded, and it was flooding with tons and tons of water. The result was a free surface effect, where all that unchecked water would unbalance the ship, and it resulted in Estonia rolling completely onto her side. Remarkably, Estonia's bow visor, or door, the entire forwardmost section of the ship, was recovered intact, and the inquiry established that, incredibly, the visor was not considered crucial to the ship's safety. It was the inner bow ramp's failure afterwards which had allowed the water to enter. Ro-Ro ferries are unique in that in order to actually operate, they really need this design Achilles heel, a massive loading port in the forward or rearmost part of the ship so that cars can get in. And coupled with that uncomfortable fact was the added design quirk where most other ships feature the complex watertight compartments to prevent ships from flooding if they do start taking on water, but the Ro-Ro ferries needed to have that contiguous deck free of bulkheads or obstacles so that cars could actually get in and around in the first place. All the success and safety fell down to the design and safe operation of the doors. It all comes down to how well engineered and strong those doors are in order to actually keep water out and keep the ship's hull watertight at all times. Lessons were taken away, and the concept of the Ro-Ro ferry had been refined so that they are very safe indeed. But human error can still creep in, and no matter how well designed your ship is, people can and will find a way of messing things up occasionally. So it was in 1987 that the Ro-Ro ferry, Herald of Free Enterprise, was departing on a routine voyage from Dover to Zeebrugge in Belgium when the ship began to take on an enormous amount of water. Within less than half an hour of departure, and with about 550 people on board, the ferry capsized in just 90 seconds. It killed 193 people, and the cause of the disaster was frustratingly simple. Those huge, safe bow loading doors were simply never shut. The crew, under pressure from constant operations and tight schedules, had failed to ensure the doors were closed, and the skipper put his ship to sea simply assuming that they had been. The inquiry called the mishandling of the ship a, quote, disease of sloppiness, and incredibly, earlier calls for alarms or indicators actually reporting the position of the doors were ignored. Battlecruisers and Ro-Ro ferries have very little in common, save for this. Their reasons for being were designed around very specific functions that made design sacrifices in order to actually succeed. Now, that by itself is not necessarily a problem, so long as the ship was used for what it was purely intended for. Britain's battlecruisers were not meant to go head-to-head with battleship caliber guns. It's likely that the barbette armour was their Achilles heel in that regard. And similarly, Ro-Ro ferries of the 20th century relied entirely on the strength and integrity of their loading bay doors. A single failure in any part of those systems could have catastrophic results. It's surely testament to human engineering today that thousands of Ro-Ro ferries operate safely around the world, and the might of the ocean is held back by the clever design of the loading doors. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.